Well, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have a lively discussion planned for today, and we're so excited you've joined us for the Fall Texas Medical Device Alliance meeting. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I want to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and to please mute your lines to reduce feedback issues and turn cameras off. If you're using your phone for audio, it's essential to mute your computer as well. I also want to remind participants, if you have a question, to please use your chat box, and we will get to those questions towards the end of the presentation. During the Q&A, you can also unmute and ask your question. Our plan for today is to go till about 2:45 with panel discussions, and then at around 2:45, we will open it up for Q&A. Briefly, I wanted to thank our sponsors, CAI, Emergo, UL, BSI, MedtoMarket, QA Consulting, StatKing Clinical Services, Gail Data, Avamine, Health Tech Insight, and Oriel Statomatrix. Without your support, this would not be possible, so thank you. And I also wanted to give a special thanks to MedtoMarket, who's hosting this hybrid, socially distanced meeting at their facility, as well as providing the audiovisual technology. Thank you again to everyone. Today's meeting topic is sales and commercialization strategies for medical devices, a topic that always draws tons of interest, from startups to established companies. I briefly wanted to introduce myself. My name is Amy Shepard. I'm on the board of directors for TMDA, heading up their marketing and PR efforts. I'm also the founder and chief consultant for Artemis Communications, a healthcare communications consultancy. We're thrilled to have a fantastic panel today for the discussion. We have Gail Page, who's joining us via Zoom, a venture partner from Turret Capital, Doug Stoakley, president and COO of ClearCam, Elaine Horton, director of marketing at Hologic, and also joining us on Zoom is Jamie Murdock, director of global marketing at Smith & Nephew Orthopedics. So really a full spectrum of medical device related organizations. Now we'll turn it over to our panelists for introductions. Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead, Doug. You can start.
Yeah, my name is Doug Stoakley. I am, as Amy pointed out, president and chief operating officer, co-founder of ClearCam. My background is actually in technology. I was a 25-year technology executive with semiconductors and computers, so NVIDIA, AMD, and Logitech back in the early 90s. So medical is fairly new to me, but I'm very happy to be here. The commercialization side is a area of specialty because in those roles I had in the tech world, it was in sales and marketing, global sales, regional sales, North America, Latin America, and as well as even smaller teams in the early part of my career. So commercialization is again near and dear to my heart, and we as a startup, an early stage startup here in Austin, have a unique set of experiences that we're going through, but probably not unique to a lot of people that are in the same stage of their business that we're in. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Go ahead, Elaine.
Well, hi, and thanks for the introduction. So my name's Elaine Horton. I'm with Hologic, which is a new name for me to get used to. It was Assessa Health, another startup in the Austin area, founded by Kim Rodriguez. Also, she's in Austin. And just in August, we got acquired by Hologic. So now I am on the marketing team with Hologic, staying with the Assessa product. I'm the brand manager for the Assessa ProView system. And let's see, my background come from finance actually and strategy consulting with Deloitte, and did healthcare clients and including some medical device companies, mergers and acquisitions, international and domestic. And then also worked at Dell Medical School here in Austin when they were getting off the ground with the chief business officer and the dean on that side. And then went to the startup world and worked with Kim Rodriguez and small but mighty team, wearing a lot of hats, and found my place in marketing, helping launch the product. 2 weeks after FDA clearance, we were launching the product across the nation. And now here we are with Hologic. So it's been a whirlwind, still is a whirlwind, and couldn't be more passionate about what we do.
Oh, wonderful. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you.
And I will move on to Gail. Gail joining us from Zoom. Gail, would you like to give a brief introduction? Okay, we'll move to Jamie Murdock. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'm Jamie Murdock, and as Amy mentioned, I am currently the Director of Global Marketing at Smith & Nephew for COBLATION. I got my start in medical devices as an engineer about 19 years ago, working on newborn hearing screening devices and neonatal technology. And from that, I've kind of moved for the last 15 years, worked for a variety of really orthopedic-focused medical device companies, and been fortunate to do that here in Austin, which is not the easiest thing to do, but working for companies like Abbott, Zimmer Spine, most recently a little bit of Pioneer and RTI Surgical. Excited to be with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. And Gail, have you joined us? Okay, we appear to be having some technical issues with Gail, and that's okay. She'll join us shortly. At this point, I think we can dive into the discussion.
Sure.
So, Doug, why don't you go ahead and start us off? And I would love to start talking about, since you are heading up ClearCam, would love to talk about what investors are looking for in terms of a potential investment and how the commercialization strategy plays into that decision process.
Sure. So we just finished our seed series 2 round, which we finished in July. We raised about $2.6 million. And we raised principally through angels and through high net worth individuals and some groups that were with us in our first round, but no institutional money. So you know, our pitch was very much geared towards those types of investors. It wouldn't have changed that much, quite frankly, on the VC side if we had gone in that direction, just because our value proposition was the same. But it was really interesting to really observe the shift from our seed series 1 to our seed series 2 on the focus on commercialization. In fact, most of our savvy investors that we have a really great cap table, and our investors we're very close to them, and they're an asset to us. But you know, they wanted to know how this was going to be sold, and we had sort of de-risked the product all the way through regulatory, and our quality system was in play. And, you know, because it was a COVID raise, you know, as everyone who's on the call will recognize, it presented a different set of challenges. But definitely, you know, we were moving through this quality and manufacturing phase while we were raising. And so the conversation landed on commercialization, and people really, frankly, just wanted to understand that we had a plan that was clear, that it wasn't overly ambitious, that our numbers weren't overly ambitious and inflated, that we were being realistic in all of the different metrics that we were measuring and forecasting as an organization. So, you know, you're not usually, because you're forecasting, you know, that forecasts are always your best guess. And so you're having to defend guesses sometimes. So we erred on the side of being extremely cautious. And now as we go into the commercialization phase, which we're in right now, that's paid off. That was a good decision on our part, I think. But those are the main things. And the thing is, again, be specific. They want specific answers. They want to understand exactly who you're targeting. We came out with very clear lines of geographic diversity, institutional diversity, case diversity, and a certain number of procedures that we're trying to drive towards. And so people can measure your progress based on those data points if you set them out early. And that's the main thing that I would say was different from, say, our first round.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Gail, have you joined us?
Can you hear me now?
We can. We sure can.
Excellent. Excellent. What a nightmare. I'm so sorry.
Oh.
I have no idea what the problem is. But anyway, thank you so much for having me today. My background's a little different in that I've spent about 50% of my career on the diagnostic industry and about 50% of my career on the clinical lab side. In the last few years, I've taken all that experience and then been working more on the investment community. You'll see from my background today, I'm an investment advisor for Solar Spy Ventures, and I'm a venture partner with Turret Capital. So I look forward today to lots of questions and hopefully everybody benefiting from our experiences.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. And I'm curious, as you just mentioned, can you discuss how a large clinical lab thinks about commercialization versus a diagnostic company?
Absolutely. So for those of you in the audience, I spent about 14 years. I joined Roche Biomedical Labs in the mid-'80s, and I stayed 14 years, and I sat on the executive management team the last 7, especially in 95 when we spun it out and took it public. But that's what I did there. My role there was executive vice president over all the diagnostics. So what we did was we worked with everybody in the industry to commercialize tests. So what we looked at was, of course, the quality of the test and things of that nature, you know, whether we were going to commercialize it to a physician, how the payers impacted that, et cetera. But we weren't necessarily the ones responsible for the reimbursement. So when a commercial lab looks at things, they look at, you know, how are they going to incorporate it into the physician's workflow? You know, is there real medical need? Are you really meeting a clinical unmet need, et cetera? When you think about a diagnostic company, which I've now run 2 public companies, you know, one of the things we really think about was the same things like what are all the mechanics you have to do to get it through the FDA, et cetera? What need are you fulfilling? But it really has a lot to do too with, you know, is the doctor going to order the test and who's going to pay for the test? So reimbursement plays such a key role for a clinical lab or anyone else to adopt that type of test. So there's a huge difference in how people look at it, but yet there's a lot of commonality.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Elaine, what are your thoughts on this from your Assessa experience?
Well, just thinking about what Doug mentioned in terms of setting forecasts and thinking about commercialization, you know, I remember when we launched the new version of the technology, so the FDA clearance in late 2018 was the 3rd evolution of the Assessa ProView system. And so with that evolution, you know, we were thinking about the forecast of sales, and the core of the technology was the same, but the difference between version 2 and version 3 was all about commercialization and scale. It was saying instead of a footprint that takes a handicap van for a rep to move it to the hospital, now you can move it on wheels. And so having that sense of what the investment is, which in that case was going from a system that was in a handicap van to all of the pre-work, engineering, quality, et cetera, regulatory to get FDA clearance of version 3 was because of commercialization. So getting that buy-in early about the commercialization of that product and that product enhancement was key. And I think just going off Doug's point, not only specificity, it's a hard word, but also using data. And so we purchased data to understand how many procedures happen for the condition that Assessa treats, which is uterine fibroids for women. Where are those procedures happening? What's the reimbursement like in those areas? And having this data to back up your assumptions and your forecasts. You know, again, we had a syndicate that was an incredible asset to the company and always trusted, but they would push and say, show us the data, show us the facts, bring all you can to the table so that you're making the right decisions forward. And as I look back, thank goodness that they pushed us in that direction, because it made the rest easier, right? We knew where we were going before we even knew that we were going to have to make that decision.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Doug?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, you have to show that you're making inroads into your market. You have to show that you understand your market. You know, data does that for you, obviously. Field work does that for you. So, you know, you get out there and not to jump ahead too far, but it's an exploratory phase. I'm not surprised your 2nd or your 3rd iteration was the commercial success.
Right.
You know, we're in our 1st iteration of a product and we're learning a lot. Now, thank goodness that, you know, I was just talking to Joe actually before this. this session, and it's, you know, we've learned that our, you know, our product roadmap is very validated right now. You know, the market is, the feedback we're getting unsolicited from the market plugs in beautifully to our roadmap, which is great. We still have to go and build that roadmap, but we're aligned with what market expectations might be on the value proposition. So, you know, that plugs back into your commercialization form. Then you have a market that's wider, you have a more accessible market, and yeah, we use that data to make decisions, not just today, but going forward on what we're gonna do with the commercialization plan.
Jamie, coming from an established medical device organization, can you offer some thoughts on this, or expand upon maybe the different commercialization paths you've experienced with different products? I know Smith & Nephew has launched many, many products, and I'm sure you've been through this before many times. So we've got startup representation. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are from a larger organization.
Yeah, well, and thank you, Amy. And just the work, being at the opposite end of the spectrum, I think one of the threads that kind of runs through this entire conversation, or this triumph point, is one of experience, right? So if you're in a new environment, like a new product, you know, on some of the startup land, you haven't done it before, there's a lot of error, right? And so we have the same thing. We're on, you know, I had a recent product launch with a technology that is now 20 years old. And so at this point, we have done it, you know, and not myself personally, but the organization has done this a lot in terms of commercializing. But there's still a fair amount of things you don't know. You come out with something that's brand new. The technology is the same, but we have a new variant, and there's always things that you learn that you didn't anticipate. And so I think what you find over time is that, you know, that the range of predictability becomes a lot narrower. Your standard deviation gets a lot smaller, but you still find and learn new things. Even in an established organization, there's still the curveballs that you think, whoa, didn't see that coming. We need to work through it. So I think it's a really interesting point. Just no matter where you are, you're always learning something.
It's true, and you can be small startup, large organization. There's always those curveballs, so that makes sense.
Maybe, Amy, just to cap on that, what
yes,
Jamie
go ahead.
was talking about. So I think when you think about commercialization too, you really have to think about where you are in your organization versus your market. Just to talk about it just made me think when he said that, because oftentimes I've been involved in companies where it was too early in the product development cycle from a commercialization standpoint to just go out and do a broad-based marketing and launch. Sometimes you want to do what I call market development, right? And once you do market development, then you may want to have a soft launch. And then you can decide, you can bifurcate, decide, do you want to go direct? You know, do you really need to build their own support, you know, their own internal, or can you partner with somebody that has an existing sales force? They already call on that call point. You know, are you better to do that? But oftentimes you do want to control the product launch in the early stage, depending upon the product that you are commercializing. And I think your commercialization strategy is highly dependent upon how technical a sale it is. You know, what type of sales force do you need? Do you need just people who can open the doors? You know, it's really hard to get a physician's time. They're so busy, they see so many people. So if you can partner with somebody that's already got their attention, that makes a big difference in getting visibility for your product.
Those are great points, Gail. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, the comment about getting physicians' time couldn't be more spot on. We have, you know, we have a fairly simple device, but it requires a little bit of training before the case. So we're asking physicians for 5 minutes, and my head of business development comes back to me and goes, Doug, you may as well be asking these guys for 5 days if you're asking for 5 minutes. And I was really struck by that, but it's true, it's consistent. They believe that they can figure out any tool that's put in their hand. And of course, if you can't deliver that quickly, then they'll discount it. So Gail's so right on that particular point.
It's because I'm the oldest, I've been around longer. I've had my butt kicked at too many physicians' offices, right? I've got it kicked out, right?
Jamie, do you feel has that been your experience from Smith & Nephew as well? Even with the name behind you, do you still feel like it's tough to get in front of physicians?
Yes, and with us, we have another hurdle too, right? So Smith & Nephew's got a fantastic investment in a direct sales force, at least on the sports medicine side, which is kind of my area that I play in. And so first you've got to make sure that you get the buy-in and the confidence, if you will, of the sales force. Because they're the ones that they're effectively your customer. Obviously, the company's customer is the surgeon, who's got, as Doug mentioned, a very short attention span, got a lot of demands upon their time. So step one is you're going to need to have a very slick, a very easy product that the sales force can pick up and then translate and say, here, look, all you got to do is this, turn it this way, do it this way. And so there's another hurdle there to make sure you do that. But that's exactly the point. You need very simple, very easy, almost, if excuse the term, almost idiot-proof, right? You can't mess it up.
I'm curious, Elaine, has it been your experience too in the fibroid world and with Assessa's product? What are your thoughts there?
Well, two things. Number one, on that point is exactly the seat I'm in right now. My biggest customer is the new 220 reps that the direct sales force of Hologic that I'm trying to win over to be excited about selling Assessa. So that's a huge commercialization point that for anyone who's early in the progress and sees Assessa as a success story and wants to get there, I'd say do the homework on making the product accessible for the reps, because even before you get into the office with the physician, you need to win the rep over. If it's a sale that requires a rep. And for Assessa, it's a surgical procedure, a new procedure that a physician has never done before. So it's absolutely a high technical sale that requires way more than 5 minutes, unfortunately. But fortunately, it's one of the newest things on the market in gynecology, and it just adds such a differentiator for the practice that leads to getting physicians more time. So once the rep can get in, get the pitch, get them interested, we find that they'll give the time. I'll give the example. Now COVID is a whole nother story, but we're hosting weekly virtual case webinars every week. And, we're having 20, 30 physicians join every week for an hour and a half in their evening time to see this case live, to understand it, to hear from the physician and myself. So I think, the beauty, of course, that Hologic Rep has a relationship with these physicians for years and is able to say, hey, I have something new, be a part of this. And then giving the physician a way to engage with the product with the little time they do have, and also now in the COVID world,
right,
a virtual option.
Yeah, that has to be a challenge. Along those same lines, I wanted to switch, still talking about the commercialization. Let's talk about social media impact on investors and what are social media impact and what impacts an investor's process with regards to social media? I'm curious what everybody has to say about that.
Well, with Assessa, it's a product. I mean, I think it's all about the product and either the stage in the product or how it's commercialized. Yes. And with Assessa, it is a procedure that is an elective procedure, and women are usually, it's not a life-threatening condition most of the time with fibroids. And so what the research shows is that women wait 3.6 years to seek treatment for fibroids. So with that stat alone, and 51% of women are seeking a uterine-sparing solution, yet hysterectomy, which is removing the uterus, is 5 times more than any other uterine-sparing procedure for fibroids. Those two stats together show us there's an opportunity of the women waiting on the sidelines for something better. And so because of those two stats, a social media strategy or a direct-to-consumer strategy, B2C, makes sense for the Assessa product, assuming it's launched and safe and available by physicians. So again, it was going back to what you said before, or maybe it was Gail, about timing and stages of the process. We didn't do a launch direct to consumer before we were FDA cleared, right? We did it after FDA clearance. I'll let the team talk to how venture capitalists and investors see that, but for the Assessa business model, it's been a huge success to link in social media because that's where the customers are. I think all of us in marketing know you just need to know your customers. And in our world, we have really 7 customer segments. Patients is at the top, then it's surgeons, but then you even have referring clinicians, you have hospitals, you have KOLs who may or may not do your procedure, you have payers, and then you have corporate. And so for the patient customer segment, where are they? Well, they're on their phones. And so that's why Acessa has created a social media platform to meet that customer there. I'm not sure if it's the best strategy for every single product on the market, because it may or may not make a difference to be on social media depending on where your customers are.
And I wanted to get back to you on social media, but I was curious, Gail, what are your thoughts on how social media impacts investors through the process, or does it?
I think more along the lines of, it's really about assessing the management team and what they know about social media, and do they know when to properly execute upon that avenue, or when they really, you know, when we're looking at pitches, and we probably see 10 to 15 pitches a week. I do. There's other partners that look at other parts of the organization. But we really look to see, do they really understand the impact of social media on their product? Some products it matters and some it doesn't. And it's really important, what she just mentioned, that you have to be really careful that you don't get a warning letter from the FDA. So I've had people, you know, start thinking they're going to do social media right away. And I'm like, well, no, that's really marketing, and you can't market till you get, you know, FDA clearance. You know, you really have to be careful. So for us, I think when we're investing, we try to assess whether that management team understands social media and where their product fits with it, and when to implement it on the timeline, and do they just really have a good grasp of it. And what we often find is that the smartest people know when the timing's right, and they generally will outsource it. Because a lot of people that are founders, they're really great at the innovative product, but that doesn't necessarily make them great marketing people. And you have to be careful that people don't have what I call founder syndrome, and they think because they had a good idea, now they can do everything. So the smartest people we invest in, they surround themselves with really great people, and oftentimes they do that in a very fractional way. So they're not carrying the cost of that on the balance sheet.
Yeah. That, I understand, that makes sense. Social media has always been fascinating to me with respect to med device, and I want to get back to it later and speak to Jamie on how it affects Smith and Nephew. I come from a large med device world, so I'm curious to hear his thoughts on that. But I wanted to switch gears right now and ask Doug, you are in the process of launching a product, a ClearCam. Can you talk about distribution models and transitions?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, we are in fact launching a product at ClearCam. We are launching our Kelling device, which is a laparoscopic windshield wiper, essentially. It keeps a surgeon's scope clean for the procedure without having to leave the body. Very simple device. Our target market is different. You know, we don't have a relationship with the end consumer being a patient. They really don't want to know about these things. But to clinicians, it's a really hot issue with them.
Yeah.
So, so what do? Well, you know, as I said earlier in the plan, our plan as a startup, you know, has been to go through all these different stages of the company and sort of adding on iteratively to the company and building it over time. So we start purely as an R&D organization. Then, of course, we layer on regulatory, manufacturing, and quality segments. Then we layer on commercialization and eventually some marketing, you know, as we go forward. And then that drives into our exit strategy as a company. And so our early day really is to de-risk the product from a regulatory standpoint, from a design standpoint, from a safety standpoint, and then actually start to engage the market in a very purposeful way. This is our first product. So the other thing that people have to think about, you know, it's a very different proposition for a company when they're releasing, you know, their 7th product in a line of products, and they have a lot of history, and they have, you know, a culture of sort of sales and track record. When you're launching your very first product from your company, your very first product, there's a lot you don't know. So the first part of the commercialization process is somewhat exploratory. You know, you definitely have that exploratory element. You're asking questions about, surgeon satisfaction. In our case, surgeons are who we're talking to. Surgeon satisfaction, commercial viability for the product within inside of a hospital ecosystem, competitive landscape. If you have a product, in my technology background, I've released a lot of products over the years. You have a track record on pricing. Well, we don't know what our pricing is going to be necessarily. We have a plan that we're driving to. It's working, but we may have to make adjustments. So that first segment is very much exploratory. And so because it's exploratory, we need to have deep relationships with the people that we're working with. So it's direct, it's very purposeful. We're picking, as I said before, the geographic locations we want to show that we're successful in, the types of institutions that we want to show that we're successful in, the types of cases, the varied caseload, the number of procedures, and of course, ultimately, there's going to be metrics tied to efficacy. So we're tracking all those elements, and then we put together a narrative that we plan to release. So we're driving, for example, as a company towards 100 cases. So 100 in-human cases. We'll write a white paper after that. We're collecting the data for it. But at the same time, all those other things are happening. We have product development. We have 2.0 being developed. We have a robotic solution that's on the plate. So the company's being asked to move in a lot of different directions. Commercialization is only one part of it. But that commercialization layer right now is feeding so much information back to the company. So we're listening right now. That's our number one goal. And then, the next phase will be as we expand that and we start to do more marketing to our target audience. And we expect to do that in the new year. But right now, this first phase is here. Second phase will be an expansion. And because our exit strategy is a little different, we're not necessarily looking to scale to, a $20 million company. So that's kind of our plan right now.
What are your thoughts on them?
Yes. I mean, very similar, right? It's all about timing and where you are in the stage. Similar, when Acessa first was FDA cleared, which was the system was 2012. We saw things like free disposables, right? To get a physician to try it, and 4-hour-long cases to really understand. But by the time the third generation of the technology came around, we didn't need to do the free disposables anymore, right? We had users, and now it was a matter of making a sense of fear of missing out, right? If you're not the physician using this, you're behind, and setting a marketing campaign about this is the option that women want. It's been proven. This is the third generation of the technology. Get on board, trying to move across that chasm.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, what are your thoughts on commercialization? I know that there's not an exit strategy per se, but does any of this resonate from a large med device perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, especially when you're, it depends on, you can take a bunch of different examples. I kind of use one from our example where recently Smith & Nephew acquired a kind of a biologic patch product, and it was one they bought from a very promising, startup organization. And there were still things that we learned as a company. It's not something I manage directly, but as an organization, we learned a lot about it, and just the tremendous growth that you can have once you figure that out, and the opportunity for growth, and how beneficial that can be to even a large company like Smith & Nephew, where as a small startup, as everyone knows, you're really strapped for resources. The larger company tends to have more money and more resources, and they can put toward it, but that can have a huge benefit to the company as well. It is this particular product is a fantastic growth engine for Smith & Nephew. And so I think it's a win all the way around for everybody, patients and investors and the company alike.
Gail, your thoughts? Well, somebody keeps texting me. I don't know who it is, but they're distracting me at the moment. So could you repeat the question? Somebody on here thinks that my phone has feedback. Do you hear feedback?
No, you're good. You're fine.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm muting when I'm not speaking. Could you repeat? Go ahead.
Sure. We were just talking about distribution models and transitions and how commercialization ties to exit strategy from an investor perspective.
Oh, well, I think Jamie hit on some really good points there. But let me just say this, because this will be a perspective maybe some of the other folks won't share. when investors, when we're looking at whether it's round two, whether it's Series A, Series B, we're always looking for what is the exit, right? And what we really strive hard to do is to work with those folks to make sure that they don't enter into a commercialization strategy that delays an exit or prohibits an exit. So oftentimes people think getting into a strategic relationship is the right thing to do, but that's going to also be it can be a block to an exit if they're in bed with, a person that's a competitor, somebody wants to purchase them. So I think you have to be really careful when you think about your commercialization strategy, how that does impact the end result on the exit. So oftentimes you want to be in bed with somebody that is a potential acquirer, or you can get out of that relationship if somebody else wants to acquire you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just watching the time. We have about 7 minutes, so I'm going to switch to some other questions here, and we'll have plenty of time to ask some more questions in the Q&A section. But I wanted to get back to social media use and best practices. Elaine, I wanted to speak to you because I know that Acessa is very successful with social media. I've seen it on my LinkedIn and my Instagram feed. Talk a little bit about some of your strategies and what's been successful.
Thank you. So it goes back to customer, right? And the customer that we're trying to engage on different platforms is different. So on Instagram and Facebook, the customer is our patient, which we know a lot about. We in fact have it broken down into 3 different personas. And so first and foremost is that research stage to know who your customer is, and then your sub-segments within that customer. And then it's asking, where are they? And so on Instagram and Facebook, that patient demographic for us is, the woman who's 35 to 55 who is seeking a different option or looking up more of a wellness way to treat their fibroids, health and wellness, etc. And then what we do is we look across other platforms that they follow and simply see what works and what doesn't. And what we've found in that research is our social media, we are trying to connect and create a community. So we don't want to really be speaking as much as we want to be listening, and we want to be creating a platform for other voices. So again, it's not really about Assessor, now Hologic speaking. It's about listening and creating a platform. And especially in women's health, that part about creating a platform is really important, because that stat, 3.6 years of not seeking treatment, well, that's probably because we're not talking about women's health issues or issues below the belt. We have babies and then that's it, right? Well, that's not really it. And so creating a platform in social media is a really incredible platform for that need, because you can almost speak anonymously without being anonymous, like your name is on it, but it's different than calling your girlfriends and talking about your periods over lunch. So again, it's focusing and understanding the goals and creating this ladder of content and this content calendar that speaks to each of those things. And, if anyone's on the phone looking like, well, give me something concrete. Concrete would be Instagram Lives, Facebook Lives, those events, those keystone events that can be a big pull to your page. And then also doing campaigns with partnering organizations that have a bigger reach than you do. Call them up, they answer, they want to have new ideas. Everybody's looking for content. You're a small company or you're a big company, that's great. They'll put you on your calendar and it will be a blip to them, but a huge influx for you. And that's what we found to be really successful.
It makes sense, especially with a rather sensitive product, as you said. So utilizing social media in a way that connects women for women's health, but doing it in a very sort of helpful, anonymous way. I could see that would be a great.
And trying to separate advertising from social media. I think sometimes marketing gets confused with advertising, and advertising is a very specific area. We think of our social media platforms, like the free posts that we do, as community building, not about advertising. Now we do have a Facebook ad and an Instagram ad, and that's a whole different ball game. That's about the product, and you need to think about regulatory and advertising, but you can build a community on Facebook without making any claims about your product, if you really want to. Now, we do make claims about the product, and we bring in the regulatory and the quality team, and we put it through the quality system. And no, it's not the most fun process in the world, but it's important. And we go through it just like you would of your brochures, et cetera.
Along those lines, Jamie, what are your thoughts? When I was, my background is large med device, Stryker, Abbott, Boston Scientific. So my experiences are probably most akin to yours at Smith & Nephew. Talk about social media use at Smith & Nephew right now, and how you're able to effectively use the medium in such a heavy regulated industry.
Well, thank you, Amy. And I'd like to start by, I completely agree with what Elaine had said. It's all about the customer, and it's all about what you're trying to do, right? And so if I take a slightly different example where I have a device a little bit closer to say Doug, where the end user, the patient, really doesn't want to know about it. You know, they're happy to not know. They want their pain to go away, and this will help do that, but they're not really interested in the how. So then your focus shifts a little bit, right? So you're looking. I'm not as interested then in trying to reach patients. I'm trying to reach surgeons. I'm trying to reach the people who use these tools, and tell them what this is the best tool to put in your toolbox, and here's why, and here's some of the clinical data to support it. And so my focus is a little bit different. I want to talk a little bit more features and benefits, and for that, I probably focus on platforms like LinkedIn. I stay away from Instagram. I stay away from Facebook. It's a different channel really that I'm looking for, and my message is different. Now, if I kind of switch gears, I've got a separate product where I would like to try a direct-to-consumer play. It's maybe a bit of a stretch to go to direct-to-consumer, but you know it's got some technology and clinical data that have real benefits to the patient, and they could probably help us on a market development type of activity. And so for that, I'm probably looking more at moving, probably not to Facebook, but I'm probably moving more towards custom websites, to ad searches, and again, you know, as Elaine talked about, trying to be careful not to blur the line between advertising as well as a little bit of an information as well. So a lot of similarities, but to me, the key comes down to what exactly you're trying to do and being crystal clear about what your objective is and who are your customers.
Can I add to that too?
Absolutely.
This has been really interesting, because from our standpoint, social media is a completely different animal, because, you know, we are using LinkedIn principally to communicate with investors a lot of the time, and also with clinicians who may or may not, or people that are interested, that are active in that platform. But my life previous in semiconductors and in the GPU space and parallel computing, where technology, I mean, social media is the driving element of outreach there. And the thing about it that's really interesting, and you were talking about it, Jamie and Elaine, you touched on it too, is this notion of community. Before you enter into any sort of social media campaign, I mean, you have to be aware of two things. One is what your goal is and what you're laser focused on. And two is that you have to be absolutely transparent. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing will burn your house down faster than insincere social media work. If you are inauthentic, if it is seen as being just a marketing play, as Elaine was saying, I mean, you are doing way more damage to your product and your brand, and you will never be, it will be very difficult to unwrap it. It's a really difficult, it's a scary precipice for a brand, certainly. And so I would say, you know, just be aware of who those audiences are, and understand the social contract that you make when you enter into a social media platform with people that are consuming that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're just about wrapping up. There's still so much to talk about. I wanted to talk about one more critical issue before we launch into Q&A. And again, if you have any questions, submit your questions in the chat box and we'll get to it. But I did want to talk about probably the most critical issue of all, of course, which is COVID. And I would like to know from all the panelists, how is COVID affecting your business, your commercialization strategies? Doug, you can start.
Well, it was very challenging when we were in the middle of, we had released our term sheet for our second round of fundraising a week before sort of everything exploded on the markets in March. And so from a fundraising side, it was a bit chaotic, but everything came together fine. I think that from a progress standpoint for our company, we kept our head down and just kept driving towards those milestones. So we weren't in market yet. We were starting to prepare to go to market. And then once we got into market, we actually uncovered something with our product that was interesting, which is that our product eliminates the need, or certainly severely reduces the need for clinicians to remove their scope and create an open port in surgery in the OR. There's been some concern, there's been some discussions about aerosolization of peritoneal fluid in the abdomen. And so when you remove that scope, you can see there's video that shows this, aerosolization coming out. And then so there's been some concern about, OR staff safety and clinician safety. We weren't approaching it from that angle, but it did get the attention of people that were seeing it. There was a lot of face validity to what we were doing. So we have talked a little bit about that. It's not something that we lead with by any stretch. But what we do talk about is again, just keeping, it did provide a talking point for us to sort of say, hey, listen, here's our product. We like to keep the scope in the body. You're not moving things around as much. Is that interesting? And in the case of, a very large hospital chain in the West Coast who we're doing work with, that was a come on in, please now moment for us. But I think that the downside is that certainly hospitals are far more bureaucratic on entry. Value committees are going to be far more rigorous on who they're seeing. So the number of slots that are available to a new product going into a hospital and for someone to vet you are lower. We have a lot of surgeon champions who like our product, so that hasn't really happened to us so far. But that is a problem. I hear that amongst colleagues of mine and other people that are in the space.
That makes sense. Elaine?
Well, same for, elective surgeries go down and business went down with Acessa, but we are seeing, that rise back up, which is great. And then of course the acquisition came right on the curve of Acessa. So that's hats off to the management team to make that happen, and our investors and CEO. What I'll talk to is now on this side of those 220 sales reps that we have to train, and a product that's very hard to train over Zoom. And just figuring out how we're going to do that via COVID. We actually have tried it a couple different ways and had to pivot a few times because of COVID. And so that's been challenging. And it's just the way I think life is now. And one of the lessons I learned that maybe would be helpful to folks in the audience is talking about those scenario planning before you do the training. So you're going to host a training, you're going to all wear masks, you're all going to be social distance. But what happens when someone gets the COVID diagnosis a week later? What's the communication plan? Who's going to get tested? Are you going to cancel all the trainings? What's the plan? And if you do it regionally, same thing, because it's going to happen, right? And I think we're all in this phase where we wouldn't have even thought about that scenario planning before COVID, but now, even if they didn't catch it at your regional meeting or your board meeting, but if they do, you need to have that plan in place so that you can easily go into it and understand what the next step is.
Those are great comments. Jamie, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of the billion-dollar question, or perhaps multi-billion-dollar question, depending on how you look at it. So for us, I'll talk to some of the things that we're seeing specifically, right? So we're seeing there's an existing trend of procedures for us moving from the hospital to the ASC, and that has hit the gas in a big way, turbocharged. Customers are much less accessible. There's no conferences anymore. There's no AAOS, no Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. Scrub sync pitches are really hard to do. So kind of forming new relationships through traditional means is very difficult. We're also seeing a case where increasing pricing pressure, right? We all know that providers have been just squeezed with COVID, right? So the insurance companies haven't had to pay out as much, but providers have had increasing costs due to COVID and decreasing revenue because they can't do, by and large, elective surgeries, the things that make them the money, make them their revenue. So we're starting to try to figure out this brand new, what's the new normal? Is this what we call it at Smith and Nephew? And I can't say that we figured it all out yet, but there's some areas that we're focusing on. Virtual meetings, virtual sales calls, right? This is an area that, is worth some time and effort to come up and focus or develop a set of focus strategies to help make that kind of the sales process seamless and effective, where I think, any salesperson worth their salt knows how to do it in person, but you really got to rethink it when you can't be there in person. You don't have those kind of verbal cues and so on. It's just setup's different. Everything's different. When it comes to ASCs, for us, it's a huge opportunity, because it's a change moving kind of totally different. It's a different customer for us. I mean, in some cases it's similar, but the incentives typically are very, very different. So how you sell into an ASC is a very different sell. And so making sure you have your package and your pitch that's tuned to that customer requires some retread and some rethought and some recalibration.
Gail, what about COVID and investing?
Well, I'll try to touch on a couple points that are a little bit different from what these folks have mentioned. I was involved in one company, infectious disease company, that when COVID hit, the entire company, just the whole revenue stream just ceased to exist, right? Because there was no money for that. So when you think about it from a very high level, from an investment standpoint, the company had to create an entire pivot and launch into, they had the sales force, they had the platform, they could certainly be in the COVID space. So there was a whole commercialization pivot that happened at a very high level, not a granular, like how am I going to sell the product, but how am I going to exist as a company, from a commercialization standpoint. And I have to say that I was very lucky. I sat on the board and I was asked to step in and help out. And it was the first time in my career, there's always first, right, that we then needed to raise capital to get through that phase of it. And we were very successful in creating a pivot, utilizing the platform. We actually raised $32 million all on Zoom. I've never done that before. So we pulled the trigger the day after the earnings call. The stock was trading well. We decided to go out, raise the money, and we started meetings at noon that day. And we met with people till about 8 or 9 that night. We got up the next morning because we wanted to do it within 24 hours. So, you didn't want it to leak out too much. So that money gave the company the cushion to create the pivot and change. So that's the way to look at things from a high level. So everybody had to adapt. Everybody had to change like overnight, like, wow, we're going to pitch all these people on Zoom. We're not going to meet them in person. We better know what we're talking about because we've got 15, 20 minutes to convince them to participate in the fundraising. While I'm on the board of some other companies that are caught in what I call the wake of COVID, right? So they had to start thinking about what everybody else is saying. I'm not getting the audience. I can't get people's time. How am I going to get them to think about that people are still having heart attacks? People are still needing their chemotherapy. And then I'm involved in one company. We're pre-launch, and we had the advantage of starting to think about when this product does come to market, how are we going to sell it? And there, what we've talked about is the importance of KOLs, because they talk to other people, and these are the people that can get out there and help you get your product accepted and to get doctors to take the call for the appointment from the salespeople. So I do think it depends, of course, on the company and what's going on. But I think, you really have to think about it very strategically because COVID will die down at some point in time. But we could be faced with another pandemic very similar, and we have to be able to move quickly and concisely, and we have to really train our people very quickly.
Really great insights. Thank you, panelists. I know that's obviously the most important issue that we're all dealing with right now. So thank you for your thoughts. I do want to give our participants a chance to chime in and answer some questions. Let's launch into the Q&A portion right now. I will, at this point, turn it over to Elisa Maldonado-Holmertz, who's monitoring questions coming in from Zoom. So Elisa, go ahead.
How important is it to describe a little bit about the medical problem that your device solves so that potential patients, users will know what to go to their physician for, request?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's incredibly important to describe that. We have a lot of posts and a lot of website information that's all about what questions to ask your physicians and like what do we call it? What's not normal. That's the way we phrase it, right? You need to know what's a normal symptom, especially for periods. Like no one likes their periods, but that's a 10-day long period is a lot different than a 5-day long period. And so, sorry to be graphic, but that's what we deal with. And so understanding symptoms and understanding how to talk about it with your physician, I think social media is a great way to do that sort of education. Again, knowing your customer and doing that in the right terminology and language is important. You notice I said period. If I was talking to the physician, I would have said menstrual cycle, right? And so knowing if you put menstrual cycle on a social media post trying to talk to patients, you would lose their genuine trust in a second, right? Because that's not the words that I use. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. That was the only one regarding, I think that was most applicable to your background. Thank you. We have another question here. The question is, how are KOLs used in the sales process? Can anyone further elaborate?
Maybe I'll kick it off and then Doug and Jamie can comment. I mean, KOLs are great. I've got one company in the back of my mind that I think it's a great example for that. We've engaged several KOLs, and what we do is we really encourage them to do publications and then go present those publications at meetings. And a lot of meetings are being held now. They're just being held on Zoom. They do a lot of international presentations for us. They're key influencers, right? They may not be the ultimate customer who you're going to sell to, but they give confidence to the people that you are going to sell to that, hey, I vetted this. It's a good product. I've looked at the data. You know, it's good enough for you to do this test before you refer those patients to me or not to me. And another comment on that social media question that you all had, I've seen social media backlash. I mean, I think it's great. I agree with her. I think it's a great way to educate people, but you also got to concurrently educate the physician community, because I was not part of the company, but I observed a company that actually went out and tried to promote it through, they tried to get the patient to drive the physicians, and it backfired on them. And the physicians kind of got together and was like, you know, we're supposed to be educated first. You know, we don't want the patient to know more than we do. And they basically kind of shut it down. So I think you have to be careful, depending upon the product, that the physicians don't feel like you went around them or you educated the patient more than you did them. And another thing we did recently at a company to get physicians engaged is we created our presentations into CE credits, right? So that when they went and heard the pitch and learned about the product, they got continuing education credits for it. So it really like made them want to be engaged and learn about the product or the service or whatever. So those would be a couple comments.
And I'm happy to jump in after Gail too, just add a couple additional comments on KOLs. I think it's really important to choose your KOLs carefully. It's a term that's really easy to bandy about, but you know, some of the things just to reinforce that Gail talked about, make sure that they're people that are interested in doing research, that have you know, the pedigree, if you will, that have the name, that have the experience on the podium, or are willing to be on the podium and are willing to do the, you know, what it takes to present. And for some folks, really on the academic side, incentives align very nicely. So academia is usually a good place to go looking for KOLs, because the incentives align to do the work, to be the thought leader that you're hoping they will be, and the product champion that they're looking to be. And then the last point that I'll make is, and it's another echo of a comment made earlier about being, you know, genuine, but making sure that the KOLs you choose believe in the product, right? They may not have to use it all the time, but you need people that have genuine experience. They can speak to, hey, I got in trouble here. They can help other physicians, you know, other healthcare providers work through the difficult cases. And these are things that to be looking for and help you choose the right KOL.
All right, Doug?
Yeah, not much to add. Again, you know, a theme that we hear throughout this conversation is stage of company and what you're doing. So, you know, KOLs have different roles at different stages in the company. They're probably consistent in their clinical support of your product and getting that message out. As Jamie just said, you know, writing and speaking, it's very important. But you have to be very careful engaging them in the commercialization process, just because you don't want paid representatives or people who are somehow perceived to be not entirely objective in the commercialization process. You want people in there that are really, truly championing your product for the right reasons. And I think that most KOLs are doing it for the right reasons. Back to Jamie's point, they don't support products that they don't support. And we've had KOLs actually come right out and tell us that they will not engage if they don't believe it. And thank goodness our KOLs do. But you just have to be careful. It's about having integrity throughout the process. And KOLs are a really strong tool at various stages in the process. But again, you always have to have an eye on integrity with them.
Makes sense. Thank you, Doug. Next question.
Yeah, this one is slightly off topic. It's slightly different, so we'll see if anybody is able to respond to it. But at what point in time does a startup or emerging device company decide whether to keep or outsource services like QA inspection, first article inspection, fulfillment, loaner program management, kitting, etc.? So I think the question is whether at what point in time do you decide to build, I think, your resources internally or acquire outsourced consulting or services? Can anybody answer to that? Or
I'm happy to at least to share experience, maybe put it that way, right? So having worked for small companies, you know, and by small company, right? So when I worked for Abbott Spine, it was, you know, somewhere about $100 million organization. So, you know, it depends on your sense of scale, right? So certainly bigger than a startup, but not a huge corporation, not $1 billion company. Working from them to, you know, to a $7 billion company with Zimmer, to a, you know, a $25 million organization on the spine side, I have never seen a place where you outsource QA nor kit management. Like these are things that we had looked at. So perhaps at the larger scale, it makes sense to outsource some of that, but small startups up through, I'd say, well, you know, 200 million, you're probably looking at managing a lot of the kit stuff yourself.
I can say from, you know, the flip side of the exact opposite of 100 million, which is zero in revenue. We, you know, when you're starting your journey as a startup, you know, Gail alluded to this earlier in one of her comments where she said, you know, we look for leaders that surround themselves with people who can fill in the gaps. And certainly consultants here in Austin have helped our company fill in those gaps immensely. And you know, bringing the right people in at the right time to help you is important. So I would say in the early stages, it's very important. Certainly when you're extremely disciplined on the capital side of your business and you're preserving capital in a really rigid way, they can be extremely helpful. And when you don't have in-house, but I think that you do move to Jamie's point on things like quality and things like regulatory work, you try to bring that in pretty quickly. So and IP work is another one, by the way, where you're trying to protect the intellectual property of your organization. When you can actually make the client, when there is a return on investment to that person that says, you know, the net value of them being in-house, weighing all risks and all financial benefit to the company makes sense, then you do that. And you try and accelerate those three areas really quickly. You know, other areas, maybe not so much, but those three, you try to transition. I would say as you're going into revenue, you want to have a good handle on those things inside your organization.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Gail,
Oh, sorry, please.
I didn't know if Gail had any follow-up thoughts or if we wanted to get to the next question.
Just a quick follow-up. I've done both. Much like Jamie, I've done startups and I worked for, you know, a $2 billion company. Obviously, the bigger you are, the more you have in-house. But I think with the early stage, people have gotten really good at having what I call fractional employees. Lots of times for me personally, right now where I'm at in my career, a lot of people, you know, they want people that have our experience, but they can't afford you, right? So they'd rather have you for 50% of the time than they had for none of the time, because, you know, we're actually people that have done it as opposed to people that theorize about it. But a couple of the startups that I've helped, I mean, we have done fractional people for some period of time. We've actually outsourced some of it depending upon the product, where we are in the development cycle, et cetera. So I think it's just, I think there's a lot of options available for people. And I think it's just really about making the right decision. But you never want to skimp on quality. And I agree, when you get closer to, you know, FDA and things like that, there are groups that can take you through the process. But sometimes it's good to have that one person internally that's managing that process, even if they're managing the external organizations for you. I did a whole product one time where I had two guys, one guy, one gal in-house, very experienced people, and we actually did everything externally, but they managed all of it, the protocols, the deliverables, on time, et cetera. And we took the whole thing through, and you know, we probably raised, I don't know, $165 million over about 5 years. But it was having people that were very knowledgeable that knew how to manage it internally. But we could turn the spigot off and on, which helped us really manage our cash in a very judicious manner.
Yeah. And just to piggyback on that too, it doesn't have to necessarily be a bright line transition. I think that there's a hybrid transition that occurs where you bring someone in who's maybe very operational, who can execute for you because you need to be execution focused. That's the important thing. And you maintain your consultant relationships where maybe they're not using as much hours as you get further along because you're bringing more of that day-to-day work, that procedural work and execution in-house, but you know, you're using the different levels appropriately.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great insight.
Okay.
Elisa?
Yeah. So if there were any participants that would like to pose a question, please do so in the chat. If not, Amy, I think you have an additional question or two. Amy, do you have any additional questions to offer?
Yeah, just giving anybody a chance to chime in. I did want to go back. I feel like we were rushing through COVID, and I wanted Doug to expand a little bit more on what your thoughts on COVID and working with, you know, with your investors and with your customers. I think it's really important that we understand, and from a startup perspective, what you're up against.
Well, I mean, there's just no air left in the room, right? Yeah. I mean, COVID has sucked all the air out of the room for every hospital. Every hospital has got 75 meetings a day on their, you know, pandemic response plans and what their future plans are going to be. So, you know, every vendor who's out there, and the vendor, I'm less concerned for startups actually, because the need for innovative new products doesn't end. Hospitals still want to explore those things. But I think Jamie's right. And when Elaine was in, you know, when you have, and I managed very large sales forces globally in the tech space, it's an order of magnitude problem when you have a sales force that's designed to interact heavily in person. Yeah. And that is how it's built, to suddenly have that switched off. I mean, that is the big, that would scare me to death as a head of sales for a large organization. Because the problem that you run into is that you're faced with two problems. One is you're not accessing the traditional channels the way you normally would now. You have a cost center as an executive that you have to address. Do you maintain the sales force? Do you furlough it? How do you deal with it? But then this is all going to go away eventually, and you need to have an engaged sales force in the market that is ready to go. So those are really big problems to solve. And I think that as a startup, you know, raising money during COVID, very hard. But we have great investors, and they were very open. There was a lot of, you know, it just meant more communication. But, you know, and now we are brought into organizations by surgeons. So that's helpful to us personally. But I think if you're a large organization, it's a pretty daunting time right now to get your value proposition out.
Jamie, what do you think about that?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And clearly I'm on the marketing side, not so much the sales side. And it's a big deal. One thing I can point to, I mean, I'm a relative newcomer to Smith & Nephew, been there less than 2 years, but so I'm really impressed with the way Smith & Nephew has handled it. They have to Doug's point, they know that eventually this will go away. It's not tomorrow, as we'd all hope. But yeah, they invested and they supported the sales force because they know there will come a time they're going to want them engaged. We've seen other companies that cut. We haven't done that, and it's taken a hit. I mean, that's definitely shown up in the bottom line. And the organization management is willing to take that hit because they're going to bet that it's going to put them in a better place in the future.
I was going to ask if there's a succession plan after COVID is over, and it sounds like that's what you've implemented in your organization, and Doug, that's probably what your experience is as well, and Gail too.
Yeah, it's scary. You're going to get, if you're a big company, if you're a public company and they're looking at shareholder value, one of your biggest OpEx is your sales organization, right? It's a massive expense. And so you're going to get hammered by the shareholders that your expense lines are high in that area. What are you going to do about it? But to Jamie's point, the minute that you get rid of all of that legacy brain trust that's in your organization, the relationships and all this stuff, then you're going to get hammered by your shareholders that you can't ramp up fast enough when this is over. So it's a really fine line that they're walking. And I've experienced it, as I said, on the tech side with large organizations that I've managed. I'll just go back to my comment. I kind of like being a sort of the smaller innovator in this particular space. There is a silver lining somewhere. And I think that that's it.
Yeah. And Gail, same with investing, succession planning.
Yeah, we tend to like our companies that have more of a long-term strategy. You're never going to cost your way to success. Sometimes you got to spend money to make money in the long run. So we tend to really either advise or the way we're investing right now is we really like people that have a long-term view, people that understand that, this will calm down and that people are still having strokes and people are still getting cancer and the world hasn't stopped because of COVID, right? So that's how we kind of look at things. We really we really kind of see, we actually, every now and then we'll take people to dinner and we ask the waiter to mess up their menu to see how they respond. And do they respond in a professional manner or do they panic, right? Because there are going to be these situations and it's how we recover from them that make us who we are. And we've all learned a lot over the years. I mean, I've certainly made my share of mistakes. Hopefully none of them intentional, but I think we learn from them. And I think it's been great today. I personally appreciate the opportunity to share these experiences with you all. And anything I can do to help anybody, especially my fellow Texans, I'm always happy to do it.
Well, thank you, Gail. Well, that was great. I think that's a great stopping point. Elisa, unless there are any other questions we have?
There are, there's one question regarding when do you transition from early sales to larger sales teams, and how and when do you transition? Like for example, from a 1099 sales force to a direct sales force?
It's a good question.
Yeah. I'm happy to answer. I would tie it to exit plan to a certain degree too. I mean, what do you really want to achieve? What is your strategic plan for your business? What is the horizon, the timeline horizon? If you're looking to scale your organization and actually go into, a really large sales numbers and try and drive a multiple for exit on sales, then of course you're going to invest in a sales organization because you're going to have to go at it, and it's going to have an impact on what product line you have. Does your product line does it align with a large sales force or a larger sales force, or are you going to do something that's smaller with business development people that are very personal, or are you going to go to distribution? But I think, in our case where we're looking at a near-term acquisition is our plan. Our plan is to exit the company sooner than actually build out a large company. Mm-hmm. We aren't going to invest in a very large sales organization. We have one person that drives our sales strategy that reports into us, and he's out there pounding the pavement and talking and forming relationships. But if you're someone that has to go and build out a lot of, if you want to have a longer tail, you're trying to get into a higher revenue position, then you're going to have to invest in that sales organization sooner, because it takes time to build the runway. Yeah.
Jamie, talk about distribution ships, and I know you have an intact sales force, but would you use distributions for like smaller products, or how would that work?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it depends on the market dynamic. So in my, my bulk of my time is spent in orthopedic spine, and that's, by and large, all distributors, all 1099 independent distributors. The big companies do it, small companies do it, and the big companies seem to yo-yo every year. I'm direct, no, they go back and forth. So I think it depends a lot on market dynamics. So that is what are other competitors doing in your market to try and get a specific answer. I also think it depends a little bit on the productivity of the sales force. Do you need to be in every application, right? So in the case of surgery, do you need to be in every case? And if you do, then, a distributor model may work. It is, to Doug's point, much more expensive to invest in a direct model. But in the hypothetical, let's say that you don't have to be in every case, right? You can come in, you can have a couple of really good hunters, really good, salespeople that are good at generating relationships, generate the sale. And then, you come back and check on them, but you don't have to be there every time. You maybe get away with a direct sales force because you have better control, and you really have much more input on the quality of the salesperson and the training of the salesperson.
Yeah, you can always backfill with distribution too. Those are hybrid models. Again, there's never bright lines. I've done regional rep models where you have, people that are heads of regions, but there's distributors underneath them for facilitating the product movement. I think distributors will become a little bit more popular post-COVID, just because because I think that people are going to try to limit access and meetings and things like that, and they can buy everything from one distributor. But that could be short-lived. Who knows? And that's just my guess. But yeah.
What about internationally?
International sale, that's a long conversation.
Yeah.
We can talk a lot about
Agree
that.
with that. Long conversation. And it depends on
Yeah,
where. Right?
international sales, you start getting into different countries, different regulatory cases, cultural differences, different distribution models, arbitrage, how you sell product. There's a lot. I ran worldwide sales for advanced micro devices graphics business. We had reps all over the world. We had distribution agreements with master distributors in different parts of the world. I mean, it can get very complex.
Yes.
So that's probably a whole different conversation for
Another panel.
Another panel.
Great. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
If that person does have a question they want to ask specifically, if whoever forwarded that question, they can reach out to us too and have a conversation directly.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any questions? If you'd like to engage with our panel, just let us know. We're happy to put you in touch. Okay, well, Lisa, if there are no more questions, I think we could probably wrap it up at this point. What a great discussion. I think everybody learned a lot today, and it was really lively. Again, I wanted to thank our panelists, Gail, Doug, Elaine, and Jamie. And again, to our sponsors, CAI, Emergo, UL, BSI, MedtoMarket, QA Consulting, StatKing Clinical Services, Galen Data, Avamine, Health Tech Insight, and Oriel Statomatrix. Just a couple quick announcements before we wrap up. Our next meeting is scheduled for February 18th, 2021. It's crazy to think about that. And we'll let you know what format we plan to present depending on where we are with the pandemic at that point. Please, we will keep in touch with you via our newsletter, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and our website, textmda.org. Feel free to subscribe and follow us as well, as we oftentimes send out new information in the interim. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you again for joining us for this great discussion. Stay well, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Gail.